Hello and welcome to Ticket Manager's All Access interview series. The latest iteration is one that we're going to focus on the NBA playoffs and the state of sports business as the NBA continues to boom. I'm Michael Goldstein, your host, and super excited to have the two guests that we do today. One is Jeremy Schaap, the longtime ESPN commentator and the host of both Outside the Lines and E60 for ESPN. And then the other is Dave Checketts, the former president and CEO of Madison Square Garden, who was involved with the Knicks in the 1990s, the last time they advanced this far in the NBA playoffs, and since then has been involved with Legends Hospitality, MLS teams, and now invests in several different companies, both in and out of sports, including Roan, the performance apparel company where he's a director. So Jeremy, Dave, great to be with both of you.
Thanks so much. Great being with you.
Okay, Dave. So New York is Knicks crazy right now. And this is the farthest they have gone since you were the president and CEO of Madison Square Garden way back in 2000, when they went to the Eastern Conference Finals and played the same Pacers then. What are your thoughts on the Knicks and what's happening? And does it bring you back to those battles with the Pacers then? What's going through your mind when you see all this?
Oh, boy. Thank you for starting out with those happy memories. Michael, the famous series of 95, when Reggie Miller, we were up 7 with 58 seconds or something. I think those are the stats. And we went down, as you know, then just a bunch of really crazy errors and tremendous plays by Reggie Miller, who then, walked down the middle of the floor with his hands at his neck to signify the choke. And it was so humiliating in so many ways. I can't quite describe. And actually it broke us. It broke us in that series of 95. And then, as history will tell the story, shortly after that series, Pat Riley resigned. He had a year left on his contract. And I just started getting calls from Southern Florida that this negotiation had been going on for months. And in fact, I got a call that said, I have a copy of the contract that was exchanged the night of the Reggie Miller game. So in other words, I now, years later, but even then, thought that our coach's heart was completely out the door. He had the all-time financial offer to go to Miami, $40 million. I mean, I was off. I thought I had a good offer on the table. It was nothing close to that. So it was the start of real change for us, and a tampering trial in front of David Stern as the mediator. I was on the witness stand for 8.5 hours. So you can imagine what it did. I was with a group of friends watching the game, and when is it Nesbitt who started hitting the threes? And
game one, yeah.
Yeah, and hit 6. And I just said, he cannot continue to shoot like this. And he did. And then that last shot, which we all thought had actually made the comeback complete and won the game, because I thought it was a 3 by Halliburton. And of all the drama and all of the dramatic endings I've ever seen, that ball going straight up in the air, and it seemed like it was up there forever. It was out of the screen. It was out of the screen. Couldn't see the ball. It's a real breaker. And I just hope this team, I think it is, I think they're tough enough to put it behind them, but they're up by 14 with 2 minutes. I think this was worse than what happened to us because it seemed even more improbable.
Yeah, I agree. Certainly a crazy and improbable ending there. I mean, Jeremy, you covered a lot of the 90s Knicks teams when they were really good for the last time before now, and certainly other New York sports. I mean, just maybe to share with people, what's it like in New York when one of the teams is doing what the Knicks are now?
This is just really fun getting to hear Dave talk about those teams in that era, because it was electric. And it was a decade where, you just felt like every time you walked into the Garden, something memorable was going to happen. There was going to be some news. There was some drama. I mean, I think about, and I was a kid just starting off in the industry, and I went to work in local news in New York in 1992, a year out of getting out of college, at the new 24/7 cable news station, New York One News, where I was mostly basically a cameraman, asking questions, in post-game scrums, in the locker room afterwards, et cetera, but often being there with one of the station's reporters as a cameraman as they were doing the reporting, but being present at a lot of these cool moments. And scrambling from Yankee Stadium to Brendan Byrne Arena to the Coliseum, the Yankee Stadium. And when you went to the Garden and you were in that Knicks locker room, and it was Patrick and Mason and Starks and Oakley. And it wasn't just that the team had a persona and was successful. It had attitude, right? And it was so deeply meshed into the life of the city. And in basketball is different. I mean, New York's a baseball town, New York's a football town, New York's a hockey town, but basketball, I don't know, I should be better at articulating it, but when the Knicks are hot, there's nothing else like it. And it's been a while. And, when you think about like all the rivalry, right? Like there was the intensity of that rivalry at the beginning of the decade with the Pistons, and then with the Bulls, and then with the Pacers, and then with the Heat. And it was just like every time you played any of those teams, it wasn't just a game, it was a soap opera. Yes. With great players. So that's what I remember,
So, Dave, this year we'll crown the 7th NBA champion or different champion in 7 years, right? 7 years in a row, there'll be a new NBA champion. From a business perspective, does that help the league? Does it hurt the league because there's no quote unquote dynasty? What are your thoughts there?
Oh, I think it helps tremendously. If you were asking me that question and I was the CEO of the Garden and still over the teams, I would say no. We want to be a dynasty, but the dynasties that have been in the past couple of decades, 3 decades, the Bulls, the Golden State Warriors, and the Celtics have always not always, in the 90s, actually, there was one time where we beat the Celtics 23 times in a row, Rick Pitino era. And I remember going to Boston. I was driving to Boston for game 24 of what I thought was going to be game 24. And I'm thinking, we're without a couple of guys tonight. And we played last night and Boston did not play last night. So they've been sitting home. And it hit me that we might lose tonight after 23 wins in a row against the Celtics. And I was mad in advance of the game. I was like mad. So, but look, this dreaded word parity, which some people hate, I don't hate at all. I think it's really the best thing for the league. And I think, these great young teams in Oklahoma City, in Minnesota, and certainly in Indiana, coupled with some teams that in big markets are really compelling and really good. I thought the Lakers would do better after the trade that never happened or somehow did happen. Whatever it was, there have been in the second half of the year, Jimmy going to Golden State, there have been things that have made teams that people really love compelling. And there's been the emergence of these young teams, and it's all really good for the league.
I'm sorry. When you talked about that streak with the Celtics, it brought me back to a great Madison Square moment in '79 when Vitas Gerulaitis beat Jimmy Connors finally after having lost to him 16 times in a row. And he walks in the press conference and he slams his fist down and he says, "Nobody beats Vitas Gerulaitis 17 times in a row." I don't know if that just popped in my head. I'm sorry.
I know why it popped in your head because the Celtics didn't want to hear about that streak either. Exactly. But I was so proud of it because in the 80s, while I was with the lowly Utah Jazz and trying to build them, Stockton, Malone, and put that team together. I mean, the Celtics drilled everybody. The Larry Bird Celtics, the Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, Robert Parrish Celtics just had crushed everybody. So to win like that in the 90s was a complete pleasure for us.
So you mentioned obviously a tennis moment in the Garden. You've talked about sort of different historical NBA streaks and the parity now. I mean, Jeremy, from your time at ESPN, what makes live sports such a compelling platform to tell stories and shape narratives and all those sorts of things?
There's nothing else like live sports. And in the age of, the digital media universe, it's more valuable than ever, and it's more special than ever, because there used to be other big tents, right, in our cultural lives. There used to be sitcoms and primetime dramas, 1 hour dramas that everybody watched, that would get, 40 shares on a Thursday night for Dallas, or for All in the Family, or for the last episode of MASH, which remains one of the highest, rated TV shows of all time. And in the splintering, where everybody's siloed and you can watch, your show on Amazon Prime or on ABC or on Netflix or whatever it is, we don't have mass audiences for anything anymore, and it's all on demand. So we're not doing it at the same time. The only thing that's left is live sports. It's the only thing that's left. And this, it's funny because Steve Bornstein, who was the president of ESPN a long, long time ago, more than a quarter century ago, and he was talking about the value of live sports at that time, before we could even conceive of streaming and all that stuff, and said, you know what, live sports is valuable. And I'm gonna botch the exact quote, but it's basically because you can't rent it at Blockbuster. And that was, when we were competing against Blockbuster. And so,
now remember, some people who are watching may know what Blockbuster is, but that's fine. Keep going.
Right.
Keep going.
Exactly. They still have that one left in Bend, Oregon. There was like one left I saw in the New York Times.
People can Google it. It's fine.
Yeah. And so that's it. Right. And it's funny, I always think about this too, because I live in a world where I'm always talking about the Olympics and the World Cup and, the biggest sports events around the globe, and say, oh, the World Cup's the biggest sports event in the world. It's not the biggest sports event. It's the biggest event. The Super Bowl is not the biggest sports event on the American calendar. It's the biggest event. It's the most eyeballs by far. It's, the place where people come together. It's kind of a national holiday now, just as, I've been in Brazil for the World Cup, and France for the World Cup, and South Africa for the World Cup. Same thing. So sports is, and I say this kind of sheepishly because you guys know much more about sports business than I do. It's not my bailiwick, but sports is all that we have left that brings us all together.
Yeah, and that's a good segue, actually. So Dave, right, you obviously were with the Jazz and then Madison Square Garden, and you've had different roles since in the sports world with the MLS, with Legends. You're doing investing in different companies now. From, let's say, 2000, when the Knicks and Pacers were playing in the Eastern Conference Finals, to 2025, when they are again, how has the business of the NBA changed?
Exactly what Jeremy just said. And it's just so great to be with you, Jeremy. Again,
Thank you, Dave.
I have so much respect for you, not just as a journalist and broadcaster, but as a person. So what has changed the most is literally how live sports drives media. And so in the NFL, in the NBA, the size of the media contracts, which everybody said, look, this is a bubble that's going to break. There's just no way these valuations of these teams keep increasing. But they do keep increasing because they're, as a media property, they're unparalleled. And in a media world now, where there's going to be tremendous disruption, people are not going to cable anymore. They're not subscribing to satellite service. They're streaming their programming. It's almost all appointment programming. The reality is sports has to be watched live. And so for the NBA to sign a $78 billion deal for 11 years. I mean, look, I came into the NBA in 1983. I was 27 years old. I had never run a lemonade stand. And I was suddenly president and general manager of the Utah Jazz. And my kids all say, how did that happen exactly? I mean, how did you prepare for that? And I said, no one else wanted that job. Just don't get all excited about it, because it was a bankrupt, orphaned franchise, moved from New Orleans. They kept the same name. They kept the Mardi Gras colors. There's a team in Utah suddenly called the Jazz, and a team in New Orleans called the Saints. I mean, you know, it was a ridiculous story. Plus, they had drafted, the year before I got there, they had drafted a young man player. With the third pick in the draft, they drafted this player called Dominique Wilkins.
I've heard of him.
And then immediately sold him to the Atlanta Hawks for $1 million so that they could make payroll. And so when David Stern asked me in 1983, because I'd done a whole bunch of work on the NBA, he said, well, with all this work you've done, I mean, what did you think about the Jazz? And I said, I think it's the worst franchise in all of sports. And 3 weeks later, I was named president and general manager, because that's where I grew up. And he thought maybe with my local ties, I could turn things around. I didn't turn things around. Stockton turned things around. Malone turned things around. And the fact that we became a compelling club. But back then, I remember when we signed television contracts that were for the entire league less than $10 million. And I'm not kidding. I mean, our total revenues were 2.6 million the first year I got there. 2.6 million, and we were losing 2 million a year. So the whole game has turned around. The NFL clubs are all generating 100 million or more in cash flow every year. The key has been hard salary cap and complete revenue sharing. And when a league does that, if the Premier League could only get it through their heads, what would happen if they did that? The valuation of all of the clubs increased dramatically, because they're generating cash flow, and there's only one of them. I mean, the Boston Celtics sold for $6.1 billion. I was on the case looking at the Boston Celtics as an acquisition, 1983, for $33 million.
It's amazing.
It's a different world and a different time, and I think you're right. I think the media valuations are driving all this, as someone who's been in the sort of sponsorships world, and people look at sponsorships revenue, which of course is way up relative to what it used to be, but is a pittance relative to what these leagues and teams are getting from their media rights holders, right?
That's right.
That's where the big money is coming in. Jeremy, go ahead.
Think about it, Mike. I mean, I did this story 28 years ago for SportsCenter in 97. And at that time, it was obscure. Now everybody knows the basic details. But I did a story about what had happened when the ABA folded. And 4 teams went into the NBA, the Nuggets, Nets, Pacers, and Spurs. And 3 teams did not go in. The Kentucky Colonels, the Spirits of St. Louis, and the Virginia Squires. Now, in the process of the deal taking place, the Virginia Squires, as I recall, just folded anyway. But there were 2 teams left, the Spirits and the Colonels, that had to be bought out. So there were no antitrust violations. I'm not an expert on it, but they couldn't just say you're not in the league. It had to be a negotiation. And so the Colonels were owned by John Y. Brown. And he took, as I recall, Dave probably knows these numbers better than I do. He took $2.75 million to go away. Okay. Yep. The owners of the Spirits, 3 guys from Jersey, the brothers Ozzie and Dan Silna, and their lawyer, Don Schupak, they said, you know what, we'll take 2.25, but we get 1/7 of the media rights deals that those 4 teams that go in get in perpetuity. So that meant 4/7 of 1 share of NBA media rights, national media rights, in perpetuity.
Right.
Which By the time the NBA finally was able to buy them out, 10 years ago or something like that, they'd amassed about $1 billion, right? Unbelievable deal. But what those guys said is, Dave, this is just proving our point. They would have rather had the team.
Yes.
They would have made more money if the Spirits had been in St. Louis. So people think it's the greatest business deal of all time. And it is, but it'd be worth more if they got the team.
It was incredible. That was an incredible deal. And meanwhile, my Utah Stars, the champions of the ABA, their first year in Utah, completely were kaput. They went bankrupt.
Right.
There's only so many teams, right, which drive demand too, right? And we've seen the leagues change their business models. We've seen the media landscape change dramatically. I mean, Dave, you were also for a time chairman and CEO of Legends Hospitality, right? So Ticket Manager certainly is in that ticketing world where they want to talk to these suite holders and the premium seats. How has that world changed from a sort of premium experience? It feels like teams and venues can't build enough inventory because they're selling out so quickly. I mean, during your time sort of around this space, how has that changed?
Well, Legends came about because the Cowboys and Yankees decided to put their brand new stadiums, arenas together in one business. From a revenue standpoint, and look, let's face it, they were diverting income from their revenue sharing model by putting it in a different business that they did not own the majority of. And so I bought a big chunk of the company and became the chairman and CEO. And Legends does a whole bunch of things now. It's a much larger company, but it was started on the backs of these two stadiums that were being built, one in New York, one in Dallas. And the amount of revenue that was being generated from the sale of suites and the food and beverage and hospitality in those suites was beyond anybody's expectation. Still, if you go to Legends at the Yankee games, you're going to pay, $2,500 a seat. Probably
and people are happy to do it.
People are happy to do it, and the playoffs are more. And so, and everyone says the same thing. Oh, the food is like amazing. It's like a 5-star restaurant. And I'm happy to nod and say, yeah, it's really great. I hope you enjoy it. But the problem is that people are in the back eating food in the early innings, so the seats look empty. So the message becomes like there's nobody at the Yankee games every time the camera hits them. And yet, revenue growth, cash flow at an all-time high across most all the leagues, not totally across all the leagues in the U.S. The startup leagues still struggle a bit and will struggle for a while. But these leagues that, the traditional football, baseball, basketball, and now baseball is coming along too. They've made some great changes and the game is shorter and more predictable. And so now all of a sudden, for the first time in a long time, all of the leagues, less so in the NFL, but all of the leagues are considering expansion. And expansion has not happened for a long time. And the reason it hasn't happened is that when these revenue streams, both in stadium and media, got to the point where these teams are making money, these owners are saying, why would I divide this pie by another entrant? I mean, life is good. Can we just continue in what we're doing? But now they're talking about expansion because they're wondering how they can take it the next step.
Yeah, and I think, Jeremy, from a journalist standpoint, there's obviously the competition on the field or on the floor, whatever the case may be. But when you think about sort of business and sport colliding, maybe it is expansion, maybe it's new media rights deals, right? And maybe it's team valuations, maybe it's sports gambling, which is becoming obviously more and more legal. How do you sort of cover those stories from hey, it's relevant to who's winning the Eastern and Western Conference Finals, but also happening over here on the side?
Sports business, and as we've been talking about, the business of sports just keeps growing.
For sure.
And it's a bigger part of the story than ever before. And, in my lifetime, I'm 55 years old. When I was a kid, nobody talked about how much money the teams made. It just wasn't part of the discussion. And I think as a society, it might sound weird, we've become much more interested in general with dollar figures. Everybody, people invest and they look at, what's going on with the market today in a way that I feel like most people didn't do that when I was a kid. And now everybody talks about in Hollywood, right? It's what was the box office on opening weekend? When I was a kid, other than like Star Wars and Jaws, it was breaking the record. It just wasn't part of the conversation. I think we are, as a society and individually, much more obsessed with numbers now. And so we talk about it in sports. And obviously, with the advent of free agency in the 1970s, it became relevant to the fan in a way that it hadn't been before. Is this guy, if I live in, certain markets, if I'm a Pittsburgh Pirates baseball fan, your life as a fan is entirely different than if you're a New York Mets fan or an LA Dodgers fan. You're living in a different world. And I, for one, think we are in an era where it's much more fair to the athletes. They're compensated in a way that is much more fair. And all of it, has kind of combined to make these much more sophisticated businesses. But that doesn't always translate to happiness for fans in certain places. Now, if you're in, if your sport is a salary cap sport, it's different. But you just can't disentangle business from sports now in a way that you could when I was a kid, and it was all just, it all just seemed removed from it.
So certainly a different sports world than the last time the Knicks had advanced to this point in the playoffs. Maybe we can end with a sort of a fun lightning round, and I'll go to both of you. 3 quick questions each, NBA centric. So Dave, we'll start with you. First NBA game ever attended?
Oh my gosh, I guess I should know this. I'm quite sure that it was a Lakers Celtics game in LA in the 80s. When the firm, I was at Bain and Company in Boston, which is a consulting firm. I'd gone there right out of business school. And Bill Bain, the founder of the company, and some partners wanted to look at the Boston Celtics. And they asked me to take a case team of all of these smart kids, right, fresh out of business school, and look at the NBA. And so we set out to interview owners and coaches and general managers and players to learn the business and really to pull it apart. And one night before, we had a meeting with our partners in Boston early morning one day. And the day before we were in LA, I was interviewing Dr. Jerry Buss, who was the owner of the Lakers. Sure. And who became just a great friend and mentor to me. I mean, we're not alike in a lot of ways, I admit, but he was so smart and such a good friend to me. But anyway, interviewed Jerry Buss, went to the game with him against the Celtics in the Forum, and then got on a red eye, walked off the plane in Boston at 6 a.m. and went right to the office for a meeting with our partners. And all these guys walk in the room and they're saying, "What a game last night. Did you see the Celtics LA game?" And we said, "Yeah, we were there. we were there."
So that's pretty good.
I think that was my very first NBA game.
Jeremy, what do you got?
It's hard for I got to admit, it's hard for me to remember. They were, it was a thing. I was born in 1969, so I was born a few months before the Knicks won their first title. And I was 3 when they won their second. And at that time, my father, Dick Schaap, was perhaps the preeminent sports journalist in America. And one of the things he was doing was writing books with the biggest figures in sports. So within the 2 years that I was born, he wrote books in partnership with Tom Seaver, with Jerry Kramer, with Frank Beard, with Joe Namath, and with Dave DeBusschere. So Dave was just, part of the family.
Around.
And we lived in Greenwich and all that. So I was really little, but I'm sure I was at the Garden at that time, and my father's not around and my mother's not around to confirm for me. But one thing that vividly I remember, like my first memory of watching sports is being in our apartment in New York and watching a game and hearing the name Earl the Pearl. And there's something about Earl the Pearl, it sounds like a Sesame Street character or something. And so that stuff, those early Knicks, and Willis Reed, I remember, would come over to the house for dinner, and I'd see Bradley at the house, and I remember when I was really little, like Bradley and DeBusschere come over, and my mother says, and she didn't know anything about sports. She says, my dad in the kitchen, who's that guy, in the living room with Dave, and he says, that's the future president of the United States, and he came close. About as close as you could come.
Yes, he did.
So those are my early memories.
The two of you did not have the traditional first NBA game attending experience between Celtics Lakers in the 80s with the Lakers owner and Knicks coming over to the house all the time in the early 70s, but very compelling for people to hear for sure. Follow up, Dave, favorite NBA player of all time?
Oh boy, that's a really tough one for me because I can go back to those players that Jeremy mentioned. As a boy in Salt Lake City, Utah, I would crawl out of bed, past my parents' bedroom, close their door, go in the living room, and turn on the Knicks and Lakers in the NBA Finals, which was always tape delayed in those days. And my favorite player then has already been mentioned. Dave DeBusschere was my guy, had my name, and he was so tough, strong, and to come and meet him and become friendly with he and Willis and Bill and all of them when I ran the Knicks in the 90s was just, and at Red Holzman's funeral in 1999, I lost such a mentor and ally, and I was a pallbearer. And around the casket, carrying the body of their head coach, was Bill Bradley and Willis Reed and Earl Monroe and Clyde Frazier. And I was a pallbearer with them. It was like my dreams had come full circle because I only knew them from television.
They're guys I love for different reasons, but it's hard when you're younger and you're covering the league, and some of it becomes personal, like who's nice, who's accommodating for the media, all that kind of stuff. And people probably don't think of him this way, but I love Charles Oakley. I love Charles Oakley, and he could be gruff at times, but I felt like, underneath that, he was kind of a teddy bear. And I loved his game. He wasn't very skilled offensively, perhaps. I loved it because it reflected my own lack of skills, obviously on an entirely different order of magnitude, an athlete. I loved Oakley, and at the opposite end of kind of like the touch and athletic skills, I loved watching Akeem Olajuwon. Even though he was on the other team, I loved Akeem's game.
I wish he wasn't quite as good as he was. Jeremy.
Yes.
94, game 7.
In particular. Yes.
He was just poetry in motion, right? The cliche.
Yeah.
And 6'10".
So last question for each of you. Current NBA, obviously we're talking playoffs and conference finals. Finals predictions, what are we going to see?
I'm going to say the Knicks are going to come back and win this series and go to the finals for the first time since 99. We were in the finals against San Antonio that year, and we were banged up and hurt. Wasn't a fair fight. So I'm going to say the Knicks will go from the East and Oklahoma City will go from the West. And, I just have to. My heart is with the Knicks. I would love to see them bring a title. That's the one thing I wasn't able to do in 10 years and wanted that for New Yorkers.
For sure.
So much. And their passion, their loyalty, their love for that team. I just want to see it rewarded. So I'm going to predict the Knicks can toughen up and get healthy mentally, physically, and win this series and beat Oak City in the finals.
Be a great story. Jeremy, what do you think?
I'm thinking back to when Dave was running the Garden. I remember the night that they advanced to the finals in '99, and I think I left the Garden because I was doing a story. We'd cover the games and then do a story for Sports Center that night, and I think I left at 5 a.m. When after all the trash had been collected, and you walk out onto 33rd Street, the sun's blaring in your face, and God, it doesn't feel like 26 years ago. 26 years since they've been in the finals. And as much as I would love to see that as a New Yorker, history repeat itself. And I was at Game 7 last year against Indiana in the second round. And obviously that was a Knicks team that was hobbled. Yeah, I think it's going to be tough to get a bet against the Pacers. And, Oklahoma City's already got the 2-0 lead. But I don't know anything. I think
that's not true. That's not true.
I don't know much. It's hard. I think OKC is the best team left standing. That's just me.
It is a good bet. I think regardless of who makes the finals and who wins, it'll be compelling theater as we've discussed, and the NBA will continue to blossom and grow and do all the things that they're doing. And look, just wanted to wrap it up here. Dave, Jeremy, thank you for joining the latest edition of the Ticket Manager All Access interview series. Great stuff, and hope you both enjoy the upcoming finals for sure.